I'd like to talk a little bit about the design of nature reserves. The first slide is a slide that actually you're going to be doing a discussion on. On the left side, you have worse, and on the right side, you have better. And so if you look at part A, it's worse if an ecosystem is only partially protected. It's good if an ecosystem is completely protected. And you already know a small reserve, B, would be worse than a large reserve, which is under the better heading. But you can argue that in some cases, what's worse on this diagram could actually be better in certain instances. And so I'm going to let you look at this and think about it for a while. And then I'm going to have you do a discussion and argue for some of the worse, what are worse on this diagram. So anyway, considerations of reserve design. Today I want to talk about disturbance regimes, which can include things like fire, insect outbreaks, and floods. Small reserves are much more vulnerable to disturbances than large reserves. And that can be a problem because if you look at this distribution of reserves throughout the world, over 96% of the nature reserves in the world are small reserves, and less than 4% are greater than 10,000 square kilometers, which would be considered a large reserve. The Grand Teton Yellowstone ecosystem in Grand Teton Yellowstone National Park would be considered a large reserve, but we don't have very many of those in the continental United States. And so fire is a huge problem today, partly due to climate change and partly due to the Smokey the Bear policy of fire suppression. And so the Rim Fire of the summer of 2013 actually it was a huge fire, and it entered Yosemite National Park. And it hit a lot of the Forest Service lands outside the park. And these Holocaust fires are uncontrollable. They basically have to wait for the weather to change, usually in the fall, before these fires will burn themselves out. And so they can be devastating because they cover a huge area. And if you have a small reserve in an area that's hit by a fire like this, the entire reserve could be burned out. Australia had a problem recently. Kangaroo Island, where that red arrow is pointing, is a small island off the coast of Australia. And a bushfire burned almost half of the island in 2020. And it had a big impact on the wildlife, including koala bears. And so numbers of koala bears were killed or maimed by the fire, as well as lots of other wildlife. And here you can see a couple of pictures of some koalas that managed to survive the fire somehow. But even if they survived the fire, there's nothing left for them to eat in the area. And so on the left is a picture of Kangaroo Island before the fire. And then on the right is a picture of Kangaroo Island after the fire. And again, over half the island burned in that particular fire. Insect outbreaks can also be a huge issue. This is a picture in the northern Rockies. And again, because of climate change, they're getting mountain pine beetles attacking, since the season is warmer, they're attacking higher elevation trees that don't have genetic resistance to these bark beetle attacks. And if you combine the trees being stressed by drought with an invasion of bark beetles, it kills huge areas of the trees. And these white bark pines are a keystone species in this area because grizzly bears that fatten up by eating the seeds of the pine cones right before they go into hibernation because they're loaded with fat. And so anyway, warmer climates leading to bark beetle attacks, impacting a population of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Floods can be another thing that impact small reserves. And in fact, this is the little dots or areas I was in India when I went on a trip to photograph tigers. And if you look over to the right, there's Kaziranga National Park, which is a very small national park in the eastern area of India, just below the Himalayas. And the park sits in a floodplain, and there's a major river running through the park, and that river floods regularly. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the area holds so many tigers, as well as the Indian one-horned rhinoceros. But on really bad flood years, since if you get beyond the boundary of the park, you can see a road that is just outside the boundary of the park. And then you have a bunch of private land that's being developed into tea farms. And so this is a picture of the park from National Geographic on the top, and it's showing you migration corridors where animals actually migrate out during the monsoon season when the river floods. And then the picture on the bottom right is a picture of that road that is just outside the park. And the picture on the bottom left is showing you some development that's occurring outside the park, which makes it hard for the animals to escape the floods. And so in 2016, they had severe flooding, and the greater one-horned rhinoceros, which is a listed species, some of them died during when some of this flooding occurred. So anyway, considerations of reserve design. What are some of the considerations? Well, biological considerations, such as corridors. Corridors will help you maintain genetic diversity. Minimizing disease. We'll be talking about that later, and you'll be reading an article on disease in wildlife populations. And invasive species. And so all of those are biological considerations, but there's also cultural considerations. I'll talk about that a little bit, and also political and economic constraints. Corridors are a huge issue. We've talked a little bit about P22, the mountain lion of Griffith Park, who came from the Santa Monica Mountains and managed to cross 2 huge freeways. But on these freeways, there's lots of mountain lion kills, which means, and the freeways serve to isolate the mountain lion population where you get lots of inbreeding. And so there is an $87 million corridor that has finally been approved, and they're getting funding between the Santa Monica Mountains and the hills to the north of the Santa Monica Mountains across Liberty Canyon. And that will not only facilitate genetic exchange between mountain lion populations in different wild areas in the LA area, but it will also allow other animals to cross that freeway. Invasive species are another huge issue. Florida has a tremendous problem with invasive species, and one of the biggies is Burmese pythons. They basically escaped a reptile farm in Florida, and they have no natural predators, and so they're incredibly abundant in the Everglades, and they're having a huge impact on basically all kinds of mammals and birds in the Florida Everglades, as well as endangered species. And then there's cultural considerations. This is Bandhavgarh National Park, which is a tiger reserve in India. India is highly populated, and so outside those tiger reserves, you typically have a small buffer area and then a village beyond that. And there's huge problems with tiger-human conflict, because if a tiger goes outside the reserve and kills cattle that belong to the villagers, or kills a kid or one of the people in the village, that creates huge problems for tiger conservation. And one of the things that they have done in some areas is basically give people money if their cattle are attacked by tigers. But the tiger-human conflict issue is a big issue for managing tigers. And so here you can see a Google Earth or a satellite view of the tiger reserve on the left, and then the buffer area right outside the reserve in the little villages. And then, of course, it's very easy for the tiger to get outside the reserve and attack the villagers' cattle and livestock. Political considerations or economical considerations are a huge issue in the Southwest in the United States. There are lots of public lands in the United States, and there's great demand for oil and gas leasing in those public lands. However, national parks and national monuments, which are very similar, do not allow those kinds of activities to take place. And President Obama designated Bears Ears National Monument in 2016. That was highly controversial because there is a big component of people in Utah that want to economically gain from those federal lands. And so when President Trump was elected, he basically reduced the size of Bears Ears National Monument by 85%. And in fact, that's the first time in the history of the United States that a monument created by one president was reduced in size by another president. And this was done to open up more areas to oil and gas development.